Can a housing society stop a court approved consent decree simply by refusing to give an NOC? And can the collector or revenue authority say that without that NOC, the decree cannot be registered? This is exactly where this case becomes extremely interesting. Because the Bombay High Court has said that revenue authorities ought to act in furtherance of a court decree and should not create unnecessary roadblocks where there is no statutory requirement for the society NOC. In this masterclass, we will understand what happened, why the NOC became an issue, what the collector can actually insist upon, and most importantly, can an administrative authority indirectly delay or defeat the effect of a judicial decree? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand the complete legal reasoning behind this decision. And keep one question in mind. If a court has already passed a consent decree, can a society still stop its registration merely by refusing an NOC? Welcome to Corporate and Securities Law Compass, navigating the law with clarity. Today we are going to understand a very interesting Bombay High Court decision. The headline itself creates the curiosity. Collector cannot stall consent decree over society NOC. Now, this is not merely a property dispute. This case raises a much larger legal question. What happens when a judicial decree has already been passed, but an administrative authority asks for an additional document or NOC before giving effect to that decree? And the second question is even more important. Can an NOC become a legal requirement merely because an authority asks for it? Or must there be a specific statutory provision requiring that NOC? Let us understand the case step by step. Part 1. Facts of the case. The dispute concerned commercial premises at Suna Mahal Cooperative Housing Society at Marine Drive. The premises consisted of 5 shops and an adjoining restaurant area measuring approximately 2,530 square feet. The petitioners had entered into an agreement concerning the shop premises in 2018. A dispute subsequently arose between the parties. Instead of continuing the dispute through a full contested trial, the matter ultimately came to be settled through consent terms in December 2022. The court thereafter passed a consent decree, and according to the report, the decree stated that the consent terms would operate as a conveyance in favor of the petitioners. Now, this is the first major point. The parties had already arrived at a settlement. The settlement had been placed before the court, and the court had passed a decree based upon those consent terms. So the dispute had moved from merely being a private contractual arrangement to a court-approved settlement embodied in a decree. Part 2. What happened after the decree? Now comes the interesting part. The petitioners wanted to register the decree. They had also paid stamp duty of approximately 1.58 lakh rupees as mentioned in the report. But when they approached for registration, the sub-registrar required the involvement of the collector, and the collector in turn sought an NOC from the housing society. This created the entire controversy because the petitioners said, wait, where is the legal requirement that the society must give an NOC before this court-approved consent decree can be registered? That became the central question before the High Court. Part 3. The society's position. The housing society objected to issuing the NOC. The report indicates that the society raised certain issues concerning the property. So, from the society's perspective, the NOC was not merely a procedural document. It was connected with objections relating to the property. But the petitioners took a different position. Their argument was essentially this. The consent decree had already been passed by the court. The decree had attained finality. The consent terms had already been accepted by the court. Therefore, there was no legal requirement for the society to give a fresh NOC before the decree could be acted upon. And this brings us to the most important legal distinction in the entire case. A procedural requirement must come from law. It cannot simply be created because one party or one authority wants it. Part 4. The role of the collector. Now let us understand the collector's position. The collector is a revenue authority. Revenue authorities obviously have statutory responsibilities relating to land records, transfers, permissions, revenue conditions, and government or restricted land. The Maharashtra Land Revenue Code 1966 is therefore extremely important in understanding the background. Section 37 deals with the conditional nature of an occupant's rights. It says, in substance, that the occupant's right to use and occupy land is subject to payment of land revenue and fulfillment of legally attached conditions. But for specified government and Nazul land, Section 37A is particularly important. Section 37A deals with restrictions on transactions such as sale, transfer, redevelopment, additional FSI, TDR, and change of use in the specified categories of government and Nazul land. And this is where we need to be very careful. Section 37A does not mean that every transaction involving property automatically requires every possible NOC from every interested person. The authority has to identify the actual statutory requirement applicable to that particular property and transaction. That distinction is critical. Part 5, Section 37A. Let us understand the structure. Section 37A contains restrictions concerning certain government and Nazul land. Subsection 1 deals with transactions including sale, transfer, redevelopment, additional FSI, TDR, and change of use. The basic concept is prior permission of the state government for transactions covered by the provision. The provision also deals with recovery of premium or charges and unearned income subject to the applicable government orders and conditions. Therefore, when a collector examines a transaction, the collector is not merely checking whether somebody is happy with the transaction. The collector has to determine what is the nature of the land, what is the nature of the transaction, what conditions attach to the land, whether statutory permission is required, whether premium or transfer charges are payable, and whether the relevant government orders apply. That is the proper revenue law analysis. Part 6. But where does the society NOC come from? Now we reach the heart of the case. Suppose Section 37A or another applicable provision requires permission from the government. That does not automatically answer a separate question. Does the law also require an NOC from the housing society? These are two different questions. Government permission and society consent must not be automatically treated as the same thing. The High Court, according to the report, found that the revenue authorities ought to have acted in furtherance of and in deference to the court decree and should not create obstacles or roadblocks where there was no statutory requirement for the society's NOC. That is the central reasoning highlighted in the newspaper report. Part 7. The most important principle. Now pause here. This is the principle you should remember. An administrative authority cannot ordinarily rewrite the effect of a judicial decree by introducing a condition which the governing law does not require. If the law requires a permission, the authority can insist upon that permission. If the law requires payment of premium, the authority can insist upon the payment. If the law requires compliance with a statutory condition, the authority can insist upon that condition. But if the authority says, bring an NOC from the society, then the immediate legal question becomes, Show me the statutory source of that requirement. That is the distinction between administrative discretion and statutory power. Part 8. What did the petitioners do? The petitioners were not asking the court to ignore the revenue law. According to the report, they were willing to pay the prescribed transfer fee and applicable premium. This is important because the petitioners were essentially saying, we are prepared to comply with the legitimate statutory financial requirements, but we should not be forced to obtain an additional society NOC if there is no legal requirement for it. That made the dispute much narrower. The question was not, should revenue law be ignored? The question was, can an additional society NOC be insisted upon as a condition for acting upon the court decree? Part 9. The High Court's approach. The Bombay High Court directed the collector to decide the petitioner's August 2024 application without insisting upon an NOC from the society, according to the report. The court also clarified that the society would not be held responsible by the collector merely because an NOC was absent. This is an important procedural safeguard, serious, because otherwise the society could effectively become a gatekeeper to implementation of a court decree, and that would raise a serious institutional question. Can a private body indirectly control the implementation of a judicial order? The court's approach, as reported, was that the revenue authority should proceed according to law rather than allow the absence of the society NOC to become an automatic roadblock. Part 10. Very important exception. Now do not misunderstand the judgment. The court did not say every society NOC is always unnecessary. That would be an overstatement. The correct approach is, first identify the statutory requirement, then identify the nature of the property, then identify the rights of the society, then examine the terms of the consent decree, then examine the applicable government orders and revenue conditions. Only after that can we determine whether an NOC is legally necessary. So the lesson is not NOC never required. The lesson is NOC cannot be insisted upon merely because someone wants it. There must be a legal foundation. Part 11. Separate property dispute. Another important point from the report: there was a separate dispute concerning alleged encroachment. The High Court left that issue open to be decided in appropriate proceedings. This is also legally significant. The court was dealing with the registration and implementation issue before it. It was not necessarily deciding every possible underlying property dispute. Therefore, do not confuse registration of the consent decree with final adjudication of every independent property dispute. Those can be separate issues. Part 12. Consent decree. Now let us understand the concept of a consent decree. A consent decree is essentially a decree passed by the court based upon the settlement or compromise arrived at between the parties. But there is an important principle. A consent decree does not become meaningless merely because it was based upon consent. Once the court passes the decree, its legal effect has to be respected, subject to the law governing execution, registration, stamp duty, and the rights of persons who are legally entitled to challenge it. So if an administrative authority is asked to act upon the decree, the authority must examine the decree and the applicable statute. It cannot simply substitute its own decision for the court's decree. Part 13. Registration angle. Now comes another important examination point. Registration and validity are not necessarily the same thing. A document may have to satisfy registration requirements, it may have to satisfy stamp duty requirements, it may have to satisfy revenue requirements, and it may have to satisfy the terms and conditions attached to the property. But these requirements must be traced to the applicable law. Therefore, in any consent decree involving immovable property, the compliance checklist should include nature of decree, nature of property, stamp duty, registration requirement, revenue restrictions, government permission, transfer charges, premium, existing encumbrances, society rights, and any specific conditions in the title documents. Part 14. Practical example. Let us take a simple example. Suppose A and B have a dispute concerning commercial premises. They approach the court. They settle the matter. The court records the consent terms and passes a decree in favor of A. A then approaches the registration authority. The authority says, "Bring an NOC from the society." A asks, "Which law requires this NOC?" If the authority can identify a statutory provision or valid government order requiring the NOC, a must comply. But if no such legal requirement exists, can the authority simply create an additional condition? That is precisely where the reasoning highlighted by this case becomes important. Part 15. The core reasoning. The core reasoning can be remembered through three words: decree, statute, authority. First, what does the court decree say? Second, what does the statute require? Third, what is the statutory power of the authority? If the decree is valid and the statutory requirements are fulfilled, an administrative authority should not introduce an additional obstacle without legal authority. That is the principle we should take away. Part 16. Exam question. Now here is your masterclass question. A court has passed a consent decree concerning immovable property. The decree has attained finality. The parties are ready to comply with applicable stamp duty and statutory revenue requirements. But the housing society refuses to issue an NOC. Can the collector automatically refuse to process the decree only because the society has not issued the NOC? What is your answer? Comment yes or no. But do not just write yes or no. Tell me the legal reason behind your answer. Part 17. Compliance checklist. For a company secretary, legal professional, or compliance officer, remember this checklist. First, read the exact decree. Second, read the consent terms forming part of the decree. Third, verify whether the decree has attained finality. Fourth, identify the nature and title of the property. Fifth, check applicable revenue restrictions. Sixth, check whether Section 37A is attracted. Seventh, check applicable government orders and conditions. Eighth, calculate applicable premium or transfer charges. Ninth, check stamp duty. 10th, check registration requirements. 11th, do not assume that every NOC is legally mandatory. And 12th, ask for the statutory source of any additional condition imposed by an authority. So let us quickly recap. A consent decree was passed after settlement of the dispute. The petitioners sought registration of the decree. The revenue authorities insisted upon a society NOC. The petitioners challenged that requirement. The Bombay High Court held, as reported, that the revenue authorities should act in furtherance of and deference to the court decree and should not create roadblocks where there was no statutory requirement for the society NOC. The petitioners were willing to pay applicable transfer fee and premium. The collector was directed to decide the application without insisting upon the society NOC, and the separate encroachment issue was left open for appropriate proceedings. The bigger legal lesson is this: administrative authorities must act within the statute. A private NOC cannot automatically become a statutory requirement, and a valid judicial decree should not be unnecessarily stalled by an administrative roadblock. That is the real significance of this case. If you found this masterclass useful, subscribe to Corporate and Securities Law Compass, navigating the law with clarity. I will see you in the next masterclass. Welcome to Corporate and Securities Law Compass. I am a member of the Institute of Company Secretaries of India, ICSI, and currently serve as a company secretary. The views, opinions, interpretations, and explanations shared on this channel are strictly my personal views and are provided solely for educational, academic, and informational purposes. They do not represent the views of my employer, any organization with which I am associated, any client, or the Institute of Company Secretaries of India, ICSI. The content is based on publicly available laws, rules, regulations, judicial pronouncements, and regulatory materials, or on hypothetical examples prepared for educational purposes. No confidential, proprietary, or unpublished information is used or disclosed. This channel does not provide legal, tax, financial, accounting, investment, or other professional advice. Viewers should consult qualified professionals before making any legal, business, or investment decisions. While every reasonable effort has been made to ensure accuracy, laws and regulations are subject to change. Accordingly, neither I nor this channel accepts any liability for any loss or consequences arising from reliance on the information presented. All trademarks, company names, and logos belong to their respective owners and are used only for educational, commentary, and informational purposes. Copyright, Corporate and Securities Law. Compass. Navigating law with clarity. All rights reserved.